Hello, it's Elizabeth from the Smart Stitcher, and in this video we're going to be showing you how to do some reverse stitching at the start and the end of your work to secure your machine thread and to make sure that your thread doesn't come undone. If you are sewing on a machine and you've not secured your thread, it runs the risk of things coming undone. So if I just pull this particular example, it hasn't been secured, and you can start to see what's going to happen very quickly. The work will come undone, which is not what you want on your particular sewing. The method we're going to show you, we've got a couple of methods. We've got one using a normal electric sewing machine with a reverse stitch function, and the second one we're going to show you is, I've used a slightly thicker thread for this, but it's using a hand-powered machine. So there are two methods available to you for that particular machine. So if your sewing machine has a reverse button, make sure that you are familiar with its position before we start sewing. So I've put my work under the sewing machine presser foot and I have clamped it down so that it is not going to move as we're sewing. Now the machine will take it through in its own time, so don't force it through. Make sure it's clamped, and I'm following the 2 centimetre line on the sewing machine for the seam allowance, so I've made sure that my work is parallel with that one. Now before I start any kind of sewing, I need to make sure that my thread is secured so that my stitching doesn't come undone. Now my work here is under the presser foot by about 1/2 centimetre, so it's 1/2 centimetre sort of behind the needle. I'm also clamping the threads that I've used to thread the machine, and I suppose there's about 25 centimetres or so of thread, enough for me to sort of wrap my fingers around without it then getting pulled back into the machine. So I'm going to hold on to that and just keep it out of the way while we start sewing. So I'm going to come forwards for roughly 3 stitches. Now I'm going to press my reverse stitch button, and I'm going to go backwards over those stitches, and I'm just going to go to the edge of my fabric. I'm then going to come forwards over those reverse stitches, keeping the edge of my fabric parallel to my 2 centimetre seam allowance marker. So as I'm machining, I'm watching that 2 centimetre line. I'm almost ignoring the needle. Don't be put off because the edge of my fabric is a bit wobbly. So I want to go all the way along to the end of my line. And when I'm almost at the end, I'm going to go for as long as I can. And then I'm going to reverse stitch and go backwards. And then I'm just going to come forwards and go off the edge. Lovely. So make sure that your needle is out of the machine. Lift up your presser foot, pull the work out the back of the machine towards that back wall, and then give yourself a nice long tail and cut your threads off. So on a hand-powered machine, there are 2 methods that I'm going to show you. Set your work up much as we did for the other machine. So I have my presser foot down, I've got a nice long tail of thread, and I've also set my work up using a piece of tape to help mark my seam allowance. Now this older machine doesn't have the seam allowances marked, so one thing you can do is work out your distance from the needle that your seam allowance needs to be, and then use a piece of masking tape, and the work then stays parallel to that long edge. The other thing you could do is use a magnetic seam guide. Pick one which works for you. If you are going to use tape, I would always recommend removing it from your machine as soon as you finish. So to start off with our first method, again I'm going to hold onto the threads and I'm going to come forwards on my machine, just turning the hand wheel by 2 or 3 stitches. Now on that third one I'm going to leave it down. So the first method is to lift up your press foot, and I'm going to turn the work round and I'm going to sew back over those stitches going to the edge of my fabric. I'm also going to make sure I know where my starting tail of thread is so that it doesn't get caught up. So I've got that to one side. I'm going to just guide my work now back through, and I'm going to go right to the edge, and I'm going to leave my needle in, turn back around again, press the foot down. Now I've used a slightly thicker thread here than in the first example. Make sure you know where your tail is because you don't want to be unpicking that from your seam. And then you would just now start sewing and going all the way along, keeping the edge of your fabric next to your marker and working your way along your work. The good news is when you get to the other end, you would just repeat the process of turning your work and going back over your stitches. So keeping it nice and steady. We're almost there. The second method that I'm going to show you starts in the same way as the first method. Make sure that you have just under 1/2 centimetre of your fabric under your machine, that your presser foot is down, and that of course you're lined up with your seam allowance marker. I'm going to sew, come forwards and sew for probably 3 or 4 stitches, and then I'm going to leave my needle in the up position. I'm then going to lift my press foot and I'm going to pull the work back towards me to the edge of the machine. So I'm just gently making sure that I'm not losing my place, because I don't want to go to the left or right of what I've sewn. I want to go back over it. So I've gone pretty much to the edge of my fabric, and now I'm going to sew over it again. And this time I'm going to come all the way along over that long thread and just sew all the way to the other end of my fabric. So I'm now ready to do my finishing stitches. I've just paused with the needle in the work for the moment so I can show you what I'm about to do. So I've stopped and I'm almost at the edge of my fabric. So I'm going to now lift my needle up, making sure that it's completely out. I'm then going to lift up the press foot and I'm going to pull it forward, pull my work back towards me for about maybe 4, 5, 6 stitches, something like that. Make sure that I'm lined up fairly centrally again and that I'm on my place for my stitches on that stitch line, and then I just start sewing again to go back over them to finish the thread off. Personally, I prefer the first method, but again it may depend on what you're sewing and what you're doing, so it's always a good idea to have a few options in the bag. Now I've finished, I'm going to make sure that I lift up my presser foot and I pull the work again out the back of the machine, leaving a nice long tail.